Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Some Christian Guy. Join me on Facebook, on YouTube, and on OneWay, and BitChute. I'm now on BitChute. So for those of you that want to get away from all the silly nonsense that is plaguing other social media, feel free to go on to BitChute. The only problem with BitChute is it's not so efficient it's supposed to load videos from YouTube automatically. And it's not particularly good at doing that, so it's not always up to date. It takes a few days. But anyway, that aside, today I'm here to talk to you guys about a particular assertion that I heard this weekend. Now, I was invited to a church here in the UK to go and preach, and it was an absolutely lovely experience. And after the sermon in the afternoon, we had a period of question and answers. And where basically the church grilled me for roughly 3 hours, which was great. And everyone was very receptive, and they didn't hold back. You know, it was one of the first, I think it's one of the first times I've ever done a Q&A in a church where people really asked questions that were rather substantive. I usually get silly questions like, can we clap in church, and nonsense like that, you know, of all the questions that you could possibly ask someone. Anyway, one individual made the following assertion. He said, doctrine is not important. Right? Doctrine is not important. Now, the reason, I guarantee you that every single time you hear such a statement from a person, it is because they are about to affirm something that is completely, utterly ridiculous, and that actually violates every doctrine known to Christianity, right? And this position is becoming more and more prominent by the day. There are Christians left, right, and center saying, let's get rid of doctrine. Doctrine is not important. It is a secondary issue at best. And let's rather focus on what we have in common with other people, and forget all about that other doctrine which doesn't which doesn't allow us to all gather around in a circle, holding hands, singing Kumbaya all day, right? And so, as soon as I heard this this statement, I immediately knew that this gentleman was about to talk a lot of nonsense. And not to disappoint me, that is precisely what he did. He went on to make the statement that that this particular Muslim individual that he knows, and whilst I have no doubt that this Muslim individual is a very good individual, a very honest and upright individual, and so on and so forth, but that this Muslim individual was basically like a Christian, and that Islam, there's very little difference, right? And there are other delusionals in the world, and even in my church. Now, this is the first time I've ever heard this statement about doctrine actually mentioned in my particular denomination. First time. But this delusional statement that basically Muslim people and Christian people, there's no difference between us, and that we worship the same God. I've actually heard this delusional statement said once before by an individual in our church, a very prominent pastor by the name of Dwight Nelson. Now, I've been blessed by his ministry on many other subjects, but on this particular issue, he got it completely and utterly wrong. On that particular day when he preached that sermon, he basically abandoned reason for nonsense, and so on and so forth. Now, today's particular focus is going to be on the statement that doctrine is not important. Now, here's the thing, right? This stance can be easily refuted by using the law of non-contradiction. As far as I'm concerned, the law of non-contradiction. Now, here's one of the interesting things, right? It's that this one individual basically talked so much nonsense in the space of a few minutes that he's actually given me enough material to make about 5 or 6 videos, right? So some of my videos are actually going to be dedicated to this guy. Now, before we proceed, let us define terms. Let us define terms. So here's the Cambridge Dictionary. What is doctrine? Doctrine is a belief or set of beliefs, especially political or religious ones, that are taught and accepted by a particular group, right? And Merriam-Webster, just so we got a little bit of variety. The definition of doctrine: a principle or position or the body of principles in a branch of knowledge or system of belief, otherwise known as dogma, creed, so on and so forth. All of those words are sort of synonyms for doctrine. So dogma, creeds, etc. Right? B, a statement of fundamental government policy, especially and so on and so forth. So there are various ways that it can be done. And then two, in an archaic sense, teaching or instruction. Teaching or instruction. So basically, when an individual says to you that doctrine does not matter, that individual is basically saying that your belief or set of beliefs is not important, right? That your principles or your position or body of principles in any branch or knowledge or of system or belief is not important, and they're basically saying that teaching and instruction is not important. Now, obviously, this is completely ridiculous. Now, for those of you that are interested in reading more about the law of non-contradiction, this is a philosophical term. One of the most famous proponents, if perhaps maybe even the originator of the law of non-contradiction, is indeed a chap by the name of Aristotle. And for those of you that are interested in further reading, I will link the following. It is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it goes through sort of a little bit of the history of the law of non-contradiction and so on and so forth. And I will link that for your own personal reading and personal enrichment. So what the person does is he says the following, right? Now, let me make an example. Here's an example of a violation of the law of non-contradiction. So let's say someone makes the following statement: no such thing as truth. Okay? So here's a perfect example, and I've heard everyone and his dog in modern days, right? In your whole postmodernism type of mentality, people say this a lot. Now, this statement is a violation of the law of non-contradiction. So why is that? It basically says there is no such thing as truth. Now, here's the problem. When a person says that there is no such thing as truth, they are assuming that this statement itself is true. Right? So you cannot say this unless you believe the statement is true. But then if the statement is true, it means that truth exists. And if truth exists, then the statement is false. Therefore, it reduces to absurdity, and it's therefore false. It's absolute, it's utter nonsense. It's nonsense, right? And now there is a difference between nonsense and a paradox. This is not a paradox. This is nonsense, right? It's ridiculous. Okay? By merely making the statement itself proves the opposite, the contrary. It proves itself that a self-refuting statement is basically a statement which proves itself wrong. So, a person comes and says, doctrine is not important, and some people will even say must be discarded. Right? Some people will even say, or go so far as to say that doctrines should be discarded. Right? But let's take this softer. Doctrine is not important. It's not important. Now here's the problem with that statement. This statement itself is doctrine. Okay? The statement itself is a doctrine, right? That the individual is attempting to convince you is true, right? But now, if doctrine is not important, and this statement is doctrine, then the statement is not important, and therefore I don't have to pay any attention to it. A person cannot make this statement that doctrine is not important without first believing that this particular piece of doctrine itself is of paramount importance, right? So that everyone should accept it and therefore live according to this piece of doctrine, right? But if doctrine is not important and this is doctrine, then this is not important, therefore I can ignore it. It's that simple. The law of non-contradiction, it reduces to absurdity. It's completely idiotic. So any Christian that comes to you and says to you that doctrine is not important, right? That person is one of two things. They're either ignorant, right? And I'm not saying this as an insult. I mean technically, the person is ignorant. They have no idea what they're talking about. They have not carefully considered that position, right? They're either ignorant or they are, how can you say? Or they're being dishonest and underhanded, and they are trying to convince you of sophistry, right? If a person comes and makes that claim to you, you are dealing you immediately know if someone makes the statement straight away without the need for going further. You know immediately that the person you're dealing with is either ignorant or is attempting by means of sophistry to convince you of something that is false, right? And I have never, ever in my entire life ever seen someone make this statement, a Christian make this statement that was not followed by something that was basically heresy or just completely idiotic from beginning to end, right? So that is how you get around this particular issue. That is how you settle this mess. Doctrine is very, very important, because without doctrine, without a set of principles or beliefs, whatever the case might be. Now, a piece of doctrine may be incorrect. You can argue that a piece of doctrine is incorrect. That you can do, right? Because a piece of doctrine may be correct or may be incorrect. Fair enough. Therefore, in that case, you then have to present a case for why a specific piece of doctrine is incorrect or false, for whatever the case might be, right? But if a person states that doctrine is not important and that it should be discarded or whatever, such an individual just is not to be taken seriously whatsoever. Now, you need to make the assessment. If the person is merely ignorant, right, that's fine. Ignorance can be remedied, right? That's fine. You can sit down with a person and you can tell straight away by a person's attitude, right? A person, when they make certain statements or whatever, you can tell immediately by their demeanor whether this individual is wanting to learn or have a discussion or whatever the case might be. But if you're dealing with a sophist, you know that there's no point in wasting your time with that particular individual. And in my personal opinion, the person that I dealt with on this was not interested in learning. Not interested in the slightest. I answered the question obviously because for the benefit of everyone that was obviously in the audience that was listening, I answered the questions and all these kinds of things. But the individual himself, I knew immediately this person is not interested in learning, because the fact of the matter is, to make such a ridiculous statement, if the person was interested in the truth, they wouldn't have arrived in that conclusion in the first place, right? At all. And yeah, it was ridiculous. And then the individual proceeded to become a little bit vindictive and disruptive after that particular instance, sort of thing, and then eventually left before the end of the thing, which was actually better. At the end of the day, when things like that happen, and it will happen to you if you ever go and do any kind of public speaking and stuff like that, is going to happen to you. Just know that is going to happen to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is very, very basically put it. If how to deal with this kind of nonsense, just go to the law of non-contradiction, and you can show how via this means how the person's the person's statement reduces to absurdity, violates the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction is what we call a law of logic. It's universal, etc., etc., and so on and so forth, right? And it's just, you can show straight away that the individual might accept or might not. You know, that's completely up to them. But at least by knowing this, you are armed to deal with such abject nonsense, such utter abject nonsense. And this nonsense is becoming extremely, extremely, extremely popular in the Christian church today. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard people say this. This is the first time I've heard it said in my church, but then again, I've got limited exposure. But from the Christian community in general, I've heard this over and over and over again. And just to show that it's because people are trying to push heresy on you, every single time I hear it is when they're objecting to something about Islam, is when they're objecting to something about the LGBTQ community, when they're objecting to something about women's ordination, when they are in favor of these heresies, of these non-biblical positions, things like abortion and so on and so forth. Whenever it's one of these worldly issues that one of these people are in favor of and they're trying to thrust down your throat, these malicious individuals will always, almost guaranteed that they're going to bring up this issue that doctrine is not a problem, and that we must all just embrace each other, no matter how much heresy is involved, no matter how much blasphemy is involved. We must all just embrace each other and sing Kumbaya and let the differences go to the side. That is this modern ecumenical insanity, and it's from hell, basically, right? You will not find such a doctrine in the Bible. It doesn't exist, right? Does not exist at all, right? As far as the Bible is concerned, if they speak not according to this word, there is no, not some, not a little bit, not whatever, there is no light in them whatsoever, okay? And it's that simple, and like it or not, I don't care. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. I hope this helps you out. Cheerio, God bless, take it easy, and I'll see you next time.